All right, well, behind me is El Salvador's National Plaza. We're standing here on the grounds of the National Library, a building that was fully paid for by the Chinese government, a gift by the Chinese government to the people of El Salvador. And the building, I have to say, stands out quite a lot compared to the architecture that surrounds us here. And it is beautiful architecture. This beautiful cathedral here. This is the National Palace, where the El Salvador government used to be seated. And we're here for the Patriots Network America launch that took place in El Salvador. We were able to listen to many different Central American politicians, El Salvador politicians, people who are experts in this region, discussing the transformation that has taken place here. And the transformation has been incredible to see. Through an iron fist approach to combating crime and gangs, El Salvador has drastically reduced its violent crime rate, allegedly making it one of the safest countries in the Western Hemisphere. Safer than Canada, if you can believe it. But it's amazing what happens when you actually lock criminals up and put them in prison. This country has entered a policy of mass incarceration. 79,000 arrests from alleged gang members have taken place in this country, garnering worldwide attention, and not the best attention as well. Some critics of El Salvador view this country as a dictatorship. Some say that the suspended civil liberties of El Salvadorians has crossed a line. In fact, for several years, the people in El Salvador have been living under a state of exception, a state of emergency with suspended constitutional rights. So the question does become, at what cost does solving this crime situation really come to? Is it worth it? And I think for many people, it likely is, because in El Salvador, the gangs were not just what gangs you might think of as they are in Canada. These gangs were MS-13, some of the worst gangs in the world. El Salvador was one of the most dangerous countries in the world, and now it is allegedly one of the safest. But that's not the only thing that makes El Salvador, this small Central American country, so interesting. Another factor that makes this country interesting is its decision to embrace Bitcoin as legal tender. In fact, not just as legal tender, but as the legal currency alongside the US dollar. The first country to do so. The young charismatic leader Nayib Bukele has brought about these advanced changes, these new, fresh ideas of the country, not always in a way that protects civil liberties, but certainly in a way that has put this small country on the map. We've been able to speak with leaders, politicians, political activists here in El Salvador to ask them what they make of what's going on here and what's going on in their country. Here is what they have had to say. All right, well, we are here with Philip de Winter, former member of European Parliament and the Vice President of the Flemish Assembly of Belgium.
Yes.
What brings you from Belgium to El Salvador?
Well, El Salvador is a model for us. It's an example. We have a lot of problems with the drug mafia in Europe, certainly in my country, in Antwerp. Antwerp is the second biggest harbor of Europe. And we import almost, when it comes to seized cocaine and seized drugs, more than 110 tons a year. If you know that the total amount of cocaine seized in Europe is 320 tons, you understand that we have a big problem. 1/3 of the total amount of drugs and cocaine is seized in Antwerp, in the port of Antwerp. So we have a drug mafia war on our hands, and that means that there are terrorist attacks, car bombing, shootouts, grenade attacks, that sort of things. So we can learn from El Salvador. El Salvador is a country where they were able to win the war on drugs and win the war against the gangs, against the drug mafia. They really, they engaged the army, they did everything that was possible to win this war on drugs, and therefore I came over, because I think what happened in El Salvador during the last 4 or 5 years under the presidency of President Bukele, and I met the Minister of Justice, Villatore, this morning, can be also an example and a model for us in Europe.
All right, well, we are here with Cesar Adario, the Vice President of the Latin American operation of Exor Financial. Tell us what it is about El Salvador that is making this country a place that your company wants to invest in and do business in.
Well, El Salvador is to discover country. It's a new player in the world. The president put the country in the spotlight around the world and also in Latin America. and we think this is an interesting place to put our money to grow up for our investors, the utility and profits. El Salvador is a really good place. It's a country who start, to insert in the world class-made countries, and that's why we are here.
And it's no secret that many countries in Central America are receiving a lot of investment from China, for example.
Yes.
That is quite obvious. What does that mean in the long term for Central American countries? We know that this building in particular was actually developed with Chinese money.
Yes.
Is this something that your company and the work that you do you see this as a positive thing for El Salvador and other Central American countries, or do you see it as potentially having negative long-term implications?
Yeah, China is one player more. If you have money from China, it's the same if you have money for other country. The important thing is, what do you do with this money? I believe China is a good partner. It's a big economy, the second largest economy in the world. That's why all the countries, not only the Central American, South American countries, need to start a relationship with China. I'm a support of this kind of trade with China. Not only this building, you have the water company and other things are so important for the country. But, like every relationship with the country, you need to care and you need to be smart to have good advantage, to try to start growth with the trade.
All right, so we are here with Herbert Esmahan, a political analyst here in El Salvador, someone who knows quite a lot about what's going on. Let me first ask you, what can the world learn from El Salvador's approach to gangs and crime? Because the results speak for themselves.
I believe El Salvador has become a beacon of hope for the rest of the world. It has shown a message to all of the nations that no matter how far gone your country is, there is always a way back, as long as you have the willpower and the faith in God to make it happen. President Bukele many times has mentioned during his inauguration speech and other speeches that God is a key element in being able to move your country forward.
How do people in El Salvador respond to the attacks from leftist media, from international organizations who say that this country is a dictatorship, that the people through this approach no longer have their rights? What is the response from the government, and what is the response from supporters?
Well, the government's quite neutral. The government's just focused on the well-being of the Salvadoran people, no matter what anyone says. And when it comes to the people, well, we laugh at them because El Salvador's better than it has ever been. El Salvador used to be a nation that was corrupted and full of crime. People cannot have the normal everyday lives that most of us get to enjoy. Parents couldn't send their kids to school. They couldn't open a business. They couldn't live a normal life because they would be extorted, possibly murdered, etc. So now that President Bukele, through sheer passion and love for his nation, has been able to restore this country, restore stability. Many globalist international organizations, they only seek one thing, to destabilize nations, because they become easy prey if they're destabilized.
What does the long-term public safety approach look like? We've heard a lot about the short-term approach, the mass arrests, the iron fist approach to dealing with crime, but long-term, how do you prevent crime from coming back in the future?
You give opportunities to your citizens, and that is something that President Nayib Bukele's government is doing effectively. El Salvador used to be a country with no opportunity, which is why many of our citizens used to immigrate to other nations. Now we're having a reverse effect. Salvadorans are coming back to their roots to establish businesses and start new lives in El Salvador because we have given them hope and opportunity, which is something essential. And it comes down to common sense. If you have a stable nation, why would your citizens want to leave in the first place?
With the Donald Trump administration coming back in with a mandate to deport people who have committed crimes that have entered the U.S. illegally, what is the El Salvador government's position? Are they going to accept people who have been deported back? I guess they might have to, but what does that look like? Has the government started to plan what that looks like with people being forced to come back to El Salvador?
Well, as a simple political analyst, I wouldn't be able to tell you what the government is thinking. Right. However, I can tell you that I'm sure that there's going to be great cooperation between the two governments, because El Salvador and the United States have been allies for decades now, and they always have been and will be our greatest ally. And El Salvador, I am sure, will be willing to work with whatever we need to do to make things right for both countries.
The last question I have for you, Herbert, is about Chinese investment in this country. We've seen Chinese investment. We know that China is investing in Central American countries as well. What is the El Salvadorian government's position on this? I imagine that they would like to receive more investment from the United States if possible, but what does the Chinese investment come with strings attached?
I believe the best way to answer your question is to quote President Bukele directly. In many of his speeches when things have been inaugurated, things funded by or donated by the Chinese government, he has been very clear, and he has said that this is an act of friendship, and whoever wants to help build can help build, but no strings are attached and no strings will be attached.
We're here with Frank Alley, the vice chair of the International Young Democratic Union, and as well you are the international secretary of the National Party in Honduras. We were speaking yesterday about the situation involving drugs and drug trafficking. You believe that part of the issue is about what the United States is doing, and Honduras is a country that traffickers come through. What is it that Honduras is asking from the rest of the world, particularly from the United States and Canada, to help them solve the drug trafficking issue?
Well, it's very easy, and thank you for having me on your show. I know it's very watched by our friends in Canada. First of all, is they produce it in the south, they consume it in the north, specifically the United States, and we are just a pathway. Central America is just a pathway, and the drug problem, the organized crime problem, generates displacement. That means migration. In larger means illegal migration. But we're just the consequence of a problem that we did not create. Each year, the United States consumes more drugs than ever before. It doesn't go down, the statistic, it just goes up. And in the South, obviously they produce it, supply and demand. And we're just this pathway of blood. For the United States, it's a health issue. For South America, it may be a security issue, but it's also an economic issue. But for us, it's mainly, as not consumers or producers, it's mainly a violent problem. So we need to be creative about this. We need to learn that the United States can have a tough stance on illegal immigration, in which I am in favor. Everybody wants their counterparts to be in our countries. And that is perfectly, and we can work with any administration to do that. But about this problem, specifically on drugs and specifically on organized crime, we need to be more creative, because definitely the solutions that have been in place have not been working, and we need to do it. And I think with the Trump administration, we can work a lot with that. And maybe in Canada, that also has this type of problem with the new conservative government or people that are aligned with our values, I think we can do some amazing things.
I think a lot of people in Canada, I can't speak for Americans, but I think a lot of people in Canada look at Central American countries that are experiencing this drug trafficking pathway, and they say to themselves, well, what are they doing to stop these people from coming into our country? Don't they have to take some responsibility? What do you say to that?
100%. I mean, I think each government, which is left or right, but mostly the right, left-wing government, we have found that sometimes they promote migration, which is horrible. But right-wing governments in Central America are we're not people that want to be displaced. We're very family-oriented countries. If you see migration in Canada or the United States, for example, you see that Latinos are mostly conservative people. They believe in family values, they believe in Christian values, they believe in Western values, and in community. We believe a lot of that, and so we don't want to leave our countries. The people don't really want to leave our country, but yeah, we have to do our own work in governments or in opposition parties and private enterprise to people have more money, have more income, have better jobs, lower the cost of living. But the problem is specifically with the drug type of migration, because of illegal activities and that people get displaced, I think that there is a shared common responsibility, because it's not only our problem that our people are leaving because of drugs, it's because the United States or other countries want so much drug, and we're just in the way, and people are being murdered, kidnapped, or displaced by this problem that we did not create and we did not incentivize. So yeah, I think we have a responsibility. but the other countries cannot just say, oh, stop migration.
Right.
Yeah, if it's because of jobs, if it's because of income, of course. But if it's because of drugs, I think we have something to do a lot in common.
As a neighboring country to El Salvador, the question I have for you is, what do Honduran people think of El Salvador and the transformation we are seeing in this country due to these policies of being tough on crime, tough on gangs? Do people look at El Salvador as a model for how they want your country to be run?
I can answer you these in two ways. First, as a citizen, and then as a person that has been in government and has seen the inside of stuff. As a citizen, of course, everybody wants to admire what has been done here in El Salvador in terms of security. Also watch that not innocent people get in on that the way of maybe countering terrorism and this type of crimes. But I can also tell you from a standpoint of I have been in government in other countries, it's not the same. You cannot compare one security problem issue or violent issue in El Salvador with Honduras, for example. There's two different worlds. You can count in narcotics, geographic placement. It's very different. But yes, from a general standpoint, of course, we want to be tough on crime. And I think people in El Salvador are appreciating that. And I think, we can maybe get some insights or examples of what they've done here, but each country has its own individual problems and how to deal with them.
All right, well, we are here with Will Donahue, the president of College Republicans of America. What brings you out to El Salvador?
Happy to support my friends in the Patriots Network. College Republicans of America is now the largest Republican youth organization in the country. And I think it's imperative that we're not only working on serving our students domestically, but we're reaching out to our international partners and forming alliances. The left has done a really great job of creating international coalitions and pushing a globalist narrative, and for decades, the conservative movement has been lacking in that. And so, as the leader of our youth Republican movement, I think it's my duty to also start working on the international stage to form these alliances and relationships so that in the future we're able to have a harmonious world where people don't have to look at the United States as a force of terror, but as a force for good.
I've recently heard that he's no longer the incoming Attorney General, but when Matt Gaetz was originally nominated, it was reported that he wanted to implement an El Salvadorian-style approach to law and order in the United States. I imagine that idea will likely come back up with the incoming Trump administration. What do you think the United States should learn from El Salvador in their approach so far to crime and in their approach to economic rejuvenation?
As a Californian, I have been able to see firsthand what lax criminal enforcement does to a state and to a country. The United States, I think, is doing a really poor job right now enforcing its laws, both at the border and in the inner cities. Drug crime is up, murder's up, violence is up. El Salvador is a test case for what strong conservative justice does for a nation. El Salvador went from a country where Americans were terrified to travel to the safest country in the Western Hemisphere. I think America has a lot to learn from El Salvador in terms of criminal enforcement, and I hope that this incoming Attorney General, whoever they may be, we've already lost one, we may lose another one, who knows, will make the decision to start enforcing our laws. Maybe not to the extent that El Salvador is doing it right now, but something like it, so that we clean up our streets and women feel safe to walk at night, and people in general feel safer in their communities, because we don't have that right now.
If you've been paying attention to conservative politics, you have come across stories about this small but very interesting country. People are curious about it, they talk about it, and the perception in the West is that El Salvador is this country that is embracing and going through radical changes, and everything is safe and very nice. The reality is, however, when you step outside of the tourist areas and you enter the rest of the city, what you're left with is the remnants of a country and a city that is very much still in the wake of brutal crime and very, very dangerous cities and very dangerous times. The infrastructure in this city has a long way to go. If you step outside of this National Plaza area, you realize that, yes, there are people in this country and in this city that are struggling with bad poverty. The infrastructure is not exactly where it needs to be for a country that wants to be seen as an emerging player on the world stage like El Salvador does. You can clean up your streets, you can clean up crime and gangs, but you're really not dealing with some of these other major issues, most notably infrastructure, quality of life. And like I said in the intro, what about the civil liberties of El Salvadorians, of people who have not committed any crimes, who are not associated with the gangs. When do they get their rights back? When does the state of emergency in this country end? That is a question that I think will need to be addressed and need to be answered by government leaders in this country, by Nayib Bukele. We want to know, what is the long-term approach to solving crime and gangs in this country? Because surely the approach right now cannot be the approach that this country takes forever. There needs to be a switch. There needs to be a change. Is it economic rejuvenation? Is Bitcoin going to bring El Salvador into a new stratosphere? Is it going to change the economy? Or is it a political opportunity? And does it sound good on paper, but is it really not that effective in principle? You know, it's important to see past the propaganda, see past what they want you to see, and realize that this country is still very much dealing with the issues that it has been dealing with for a long time. Things aren't going to change overnight, and it's going to take a very long time for this country to fully change from where it is right now. Signing out from San Salvador, El Salvador, Harrison Faulkner for True North.